My hand was shaking so hard the pen made the signature jagged, like someone had traced my name through gravel. But I kept it moving until the last loop finished and the papers were mine. I sat at a cramped kitchen table in Mrs. Parker's sunroom and felt every second stretch into something both electric and hollow, like I declimbed to the top of a cliff and found a porch light waiting for me. 6 years of overtime, 2 jobs at once for long stretches, a weekend side business selling refurbished furniture and odd jobs in the neighborhood. All of it folded into the small stack of paper on the table that now had my name stamped on it. This was 412 Cedar Grove Lane, Willow Creek, a 4-bedroom bungalow with a wraparound porch and original hardwood that sighed when you walked across it, and a kitchen that looked like it should be in a magazine but still smelled faintly of Mrs. Parker's lemon soap. I remember thinking wildly that every detail belonged to me even before I drove away with the keys. Mrs. Parker pressed the brass key into my palm like it was some sort of talisman, her fingers warm and slightly trembling from age or nerves or both. And she leaned in close and whispered, "This house needs a home." I smiled because everybody expects you to smile at that line, but under my ribs something raw lit up, gratitude mixed with alarm, the feeling that I'd stepped into an arena where nothing was guaranteed and everything could be taken. I bought my own porch swing and hung it myself, strung cheap white lights along the eaves that made the night softer, planted bulbs in the flower bed so the spring would have a promise, and coaxed a tiny rescue cat named Scout out from under a neighbor's porch after he followed me home one dusk. Scout is part of it now. He naps on the original hardwood and leaves small punctuation marks of fur across the floors I sanded myself. I closed without telling anyone because I wanted to test whether I could be the kind of person who set a boundary and kept it. No calls, no fanfare, no "oh my god you did it" texts. I wanted to arrive somewhere and announce myself by opening the front door, not by repeating my old script of asking permission. For 6 years, I learned to become invisible in the way people who keep paying other people's bills become invisible. I worked until my elbows ached and took small victories home with me like contraband. Signing those papers felt like the first time I stopped apologizing for wanting more than a hand-me-down life. So imagine me at my desk on a Wednesday, my head full of spreadsheets and half-finished emails, when my phone buzzed on the concrete beside my keyboard like a warning. The notification popped up "Secure View," front porch motion detected, and a live thumbnail blinked at me with the little rotating buffer circle you get just before something terrible becomes real. The time stamped through the app read 4/12/2025 11:17:09 a.m. and the app counter showed 9 minutes into their visit, apparently, which meant they'd been treating my house like a stop on a Sunday drive for 9 whole minutes before I knew anything about it. I tapped it open with my middle finger and the feed filled the screen. There she was, my mother Laura Miller, shoulders squared in a coat that had belonged to my grandmother, keys in her hand, the porch lights I'd strung making a halo around her hair. She didn't look furtive. She looked entitled, like she'd been there 100 times and was simply putting dust back in its place for me. Behind her came Jessica, Noah's wife, laughing too loud at a story I couldn't hear, and Monica, Realtor Monica from the PTA, who could point out a bay window and sound like a closing paragraph. The camera caught Scout's tail as he skirted into view, curious and unalarmed, slipping past the gap in the door when she opened it. My throat tightened so hard I could taste metal. I watched my mother unlock the front door and usher them in as if it were their right. The kind of movement that had been allowed in my life for as long as I could remember, assuming, entering, rearranging. My coffee went cold in my hand, and my chest started to do that flapping thing where the air won't settle. I felt ridiculous and justified at once, like a kid caught with his hand in a jar who had actually bought the jar in the first place. I watched the timestamp tick and the buffer wheel spin while I tried to think like someone who wasn't afraid to lose everything he'd built in secret. I watched Laura step over the threshold, shoulders rolling back, and for a strange second I could see every anniversary and birthday where I'd been the one to show up empty-handed while other people took center stage. The phone vibrated again, urgent and small, and I realized my palms were already wet. When I think about the house I bought in secret, the first image that comes is the porch swing I welded myself and strung with the lights that make the night look softer. The swing hangs on the far corner of the wraparound porch at 412 Cedar Grove Lane, hung low enough that my feet brush the floorboards when I sit, and it creaks like an old friend when the wind comes from the south. I sanded those original maple floors until my palms were raw, and the house smelled like sawdust and varnish and stubbornness. And every scar I left in that wood is intentional, a map of me learning to take care of something that doesn't belong to anyone but me now. The kitchen is stupidly perfect in the way I wanted it to be: farmhouse sink, Subway tile, a butcher block island I sealed twice, and a marble counter that cheers me up when I pour coffee and chop an onion. It looks like a magazine spread when the light hits it just right, but it's still lived in. A dent on the edge of the island from a dropped skillet, a chipped mug from college on the top shelf, a jar of dried oregano that came from my neighbor's garden. Scout, my ginger rescue, has a sunspot where he melts into the maple each morning and leaves soft, patient paw prints that make the floor feel like proof I belong here. He sleeps at the place where the sunlight falls exactly the way I planned it to, a little pool of heat on the hardwood that I fought for by putting the swing where I did. People like to think houses are just walls and roofs, but this one is full of choices I made in private, and that's what matters. I saved for 6 years the way people save for something they know will change them. Construction work at night, dental tech shifts during the day, and a weekend photography sideline where I shot family portraits until my back ached. I didn't use those years to brag, I used them to get quiet things right. The side business paid for the lights and the flower bulbs I planted along the walk. The construction work paid for the hinges I replaced, and the dental teching brought the steady checks that stopped me from having to ask for help. Every selection, the maple floors, the swing, the pendant lights over the island, was deliberate, not a show of taste but an act of making a claim. I remember standing in the entryway the first night with the box of Mrs. Parker's keys in my hand and thinking about how I had been the middle kid who learned to step back, who learned to give people room until they took it. For years my family assumed I would be the one who didn't mind them taking things, the one who would quietly move her boxes around and hand over a plate. This house was the opposite of that script, a physical, quiet line in the sand. When I sanded the floors, I thought about how I'd been sanding down the edges of my life for other people for years, and how I wanted to keep a few edges for myself. I put the bulbs in the flower bed in late October with numb fingers and a small radio on my shoulder, shoving little promises of color into the cold earth, because building a future feels like staking a garden. I welded the porch swing in the garage after midnight, breathing through the sparks while I listened to old records and tried to imagine the kind of person who could close a door on that old version of himself. I didn't tell anyone I was doing any of this because people you love will sometimes treat your home like a public forum if you let them, and I wanted to see whether I could make a private place before I invited them back in. Secrecy wasn't about hiding triumph so much as conserving it. I wanted to find out what it felt like to make a choice without checking the room for permission. It was also practical, a buffer against the asking, the leaning in, the casual assumptions that my life was always there for others to rest upon. I wanted a place where I could be messy and small and still belong without getting swallowed by other people's needs. So I kept it quiet, built it carefully, and gave Scout a sunspot because even small freedoms deserve company. When I watch the porch camera, when I see someone else using the swing or stepping on the maple like they always had a right to it, it pinches a way that's not just about the wood. It's about boundaries. The house is more than a house for me. It is a pronunciation of my own name in a room that can finally answer back. Every detail I chose is a sentence in that pronunciation. And when that sentence gets interrupted, I can feel all 6 years of quiet work tighten into the kind of anger that looks more like grief than fury. My phone buzzed like a horn in a quiet room and I grabbed it before it could finish, thumb swiping the notification with a kind of hunger I hadn't known I had. The app screamed Secure View across the top, and the thumbnail buffer spun like it was trying to catch its breath, all grain and shadow until the picture snapped to life and the porch filled the frame. The timestamp read 4/12/2025 11:17:09 a.m. and a little counter below it showed 00:09:00 9 minutes into a visit that I hadn't been invited to observe. The porch swing I welded caught the stray light and threw a thin, dreamy line across the maple, Scout's tail flicking in the corner as if he had the same private curiosity I did. I felt my chest tighten like a fist. The feed was grainy, like someone had filmed through rain, but the shapes were clear enough. My mother in that old gray coat she always wore when she wanted to look put together, fumbling through her purse on the bottom step as if she was searching for something she'd always owned. Her fingers came up with a brass key, and she smiled that small, certain smile she uses when she's sure she knows better than you, when she thinks her sense of right overrides yours. Behind her, Jessica and Monica shuffled up the steps, their laughter bright and careless, and I watched the key click and the deadbolt turn on a house that no one but me had been told about. For a second, the feed felt like a horror movie that was also my life. She opened the door like she had permission, shoulders forward, and ushered them in with the easy hand of someone who have always been welcome in other people's rooms. Through the doorway I could see them move. A blue armchair nudged from one corner to another as if the living room were a sandbox, cabinet doors flung open like pages being read aloud. Monica tapping a tape measure across my butcher block and nodding the way realtors nod at things they could sell again. Jessica pulled a stack of napkins from a drawer and pretended to fold them into a display, laughing like she was playing house, while my house was being rearranged in real time. My stomach dropped like I'd been shoved down a flight of stairs. They found Scout, who blinked and followed them reluctantly, the camera catching his back as he threaded between Monica's heels. Monica ran a hand along the maple, tapping a rhythm that sounded like entitlement, and then she opened the lower cabinet and yanked out a set of pans, stacking them on the counter as if she'd been living there for months. At one point, Laura leaned over the island and smoothed her palm across the butcher block like she was claiming territory with a touch. The live feed kept buffering for a beat and then catching up, so my view flicked from a close-up of Scout's ear to a wide shot of them laughing and making plans that didn't involve me. They left a note on the counter, folded in a casual triangle as if leaving instructions on a coffee table were the same as leaving a love note. I watched Laura take a pen and scribble in that looping, deliberate hand of hers, the one I grew up trying to imitate for birthday cards and never quite got right. The camera zoomed and I could read it clear as a slap. Ryan, I couldn't help myself. Moved the blue chair by the window, left bulbs in the garden, put the guest key under the bowl. Call me. Love, Mom. Seeing those words in her handwriting on my counter felt like someone had reached into my chest and flattened my ribs. My blood ran cold in my veins and my stomach unclenched into an empty, falling thing. My hands went numb all the way to the fingertips, like a cold hand had turned off the circuits. The mouth of the app was a small rectangle, and yet everything inside it was huge and private and ruined. I replayed the part where she put the key under the bowl, the kind of domestic smallness that translates to permission in her world, and I could feel a rusting, old embarrassment I had carried since childhood tightening into something sharper. It wasn't just that they'd been inside my house. It was that they'd left a breadcrumb trail of presumptions, as if I were a room in a house they could dust while the owner was out. I sat there, the office humming, my coffee gone cold, and understood with a precise clarity that secrecy had been the only way I could make this mine without everyone rearranging it into what they thought my life should look like. The app replayed their exit feet on the wraparound porch, the swing creaking as Laura paused and looked back like she owned the view. The counter ticked past 9 minutes and the little buffer wheel spun, but there was no buffering left for how I felt. Something inside me that had been built in private for 6 years had just been guessed at, rewritten with a pen in my mother's looping script. The drive home felt like a movie shot in close-up. Red brake lights smeared across my windshield, a chorus of horns and my own pulse keeping time and me thinking too fast for any sensible order. I could feel the phone warm in my pocket where the secure view alert had lived, and every question that had lived in me for years started sprinting. Did she know I closed? Did she think she could just walk in? Was this a kindness gone wrong or a fistful of entitlement? The road blurred into streaks of tail lights, and I slammed my foot a little harder against the gas because sitting still felt worse than risking the speed. When I turned down Cedar Grove Lane, the porch lights I'd strung flickered like little white witnesses, and I could see the swing leaning empty in the corner, moving slightly in its own memory of motion. The front door was ajar, a thin line of dark between the jamb, and my stomach knotted into itself as if someone had pulled a string and cinched me tight. I stopped the car and left the engine running like a heartbeat, then got out and walked up the steps slow because I wanted to look like I belonged there even while my chest felt like it was being judged. The smells hit me first, cold air rushing from an open fridge and the faint scent of lemon cleaner that Mrs. Parker had used for years, now ghosting through my kitchen like an accusation. The fridge door was open, a wobbly stack of condiments asking for attention, and one shelf was pulled out slightly like someone had meant to take a photo of the inside. Cushions were shifted from the couch to the chair by the window where Laura had claimed a view, and a coaster was upside down on the island like a cartographer's map of trespass. Scout appeared, rubbing my shin with confused affection, and then darted under the chair where they'd been moving things as if to hide from the whole scene. On the counter, folded into a tidy triangle like something left at a bed and breakfast, was another note in her looping script. I picked it up with an almost clinical calm and read, "Saw so much potential, moved the blue chair by the window, left the guest key under the bowl, we'll talk tonight. Love, Mom." The words were almost polite enough to be brazen. My blood went ice cold and the world narrowed. The laminate sheen of the island, the curl of the paper under my thumb, and 1,000 small moments in my childhood that explained why permission felt like a currency I'd never quite earned. My hands shook hard enough to crumple the corner of the note. I cataloged everything like a cheap detective show because that's what you do when you don't want to fall apart in front of the evidence. Photos with my phone wide shot, close-up of the fridge, the note, Scout's paw by the counter, and I backed up the security clip to the cloud before I did anything else. It felt almost obscene to inventory my own life, to turn tenderness and sweat into files and timestamps. But I needed proof so people couldn't rewrite the scene later with better intentions. Each picture was a small bolt in place, something to hold against the spin of family stories that always favored convenience over my boundaries. I called work with a voice I practiced in the car and on the verge of the porch. "Hey Ryan, family emergency, I need the day." It was the rehearsed excuse you give so questions don't come fast and curious. They accepted it. It was useful to be believed even when I felt ridiculous for needing belief at all. Hanging up, I thought about the 9 minutes on the porch camera and how casual they had been in my house. And I knew in a soft, clear way that this could not stand as an invitation or a precedent. I didn't change the locks that night because I wanted the choice to be deliberate, not a rage move made with cold hands and hot blood. Instead, I sat with Scout on the floor and Googled locksmiths until my eyes blurred, reading credits and reviews like an archaeologist reading ruins. I found a name I kept circling: SecureLock, a guy named Carlos who had photos of neat toolkits and stiff caps in his profile, and I booked the earliest slot I could get because the next morning I planned to make my boundary physical: new deadbolts, new keys, every entrance recut if I had to. I saved the footage, I saved the note, and I practiced the sentence I would say when my mother knocked. "You must call before you enter, you must ask." Saying it out loud in the empty kitchen felt ridiculous and powerful, like planting a flag. I went to bed with Scout curled against my ribs and my hands still full of the paper that said we'd talk tonight, while in my head I already rehearsed how I would make that talk mean something different this time. Carlos had the trunk open before he finished the first apology for the hour he was late, and his tools gleamed under the porch light like a small, obedient army. He was a big man with quick hands and a face that had learned not to be surprised by domestic storms, and he moved through the house like someone who knew where every problem began and where it ended: at a latch. He started with the front deadbolt, its old innards groaning like something wounded, and he worked with an oil hiss and a patient clink that felt almost tender. He swapped in a new deadbolt that folded into the frame like a promise and tested the key twice, then 3 times, each turn sounding softer and more final than the one before. Carlos didn't ask about feelings. He asked about entry points and wear patterns and whether the back gate had been giving me trouble. When I said yes, he nodded and moved to the gate with the same quiet efficiency, replacing the rusted latch and installing a fresh lock that snapped with a satisfying, uncompromising click. He handed me a ring of new keys and watched me try each one in a slow, deliberate way that made this moment feel like a small ritual of ownership. "You're good," he said, voice flat like someone who'd seen too many people argue about who owns what in this small, private world. He quoted a price I paid, he packed up, and he left a smell of oil and new metal and the memory of tidy work behind. When he left, the house felt different in a way I hadn't expected: smaller, defined. The locks were a line I could point to and say, "This is mine." Scout trailed behind Carlos's boots and then wound himself around my legs like an apology, purring in a way that steadied me. I put the new keys in a drawer and felt ridiculous for letting a piece of brass make me feel powerful, but that's the thing about boundaries. Sometimes they come with hardware and you have to accept that. The porch light haloed the front step like a sun at evening, and the swing hung empty and patient. The pounding started like a drumbeat that didn't belong to any music I knew, loud and hard enough to rattle the panes. Laura's silhouette filled the glass, her hair a crown backlit by the porch light, and she shouted my name like a verdict. Her face was a map of reasons: anger, hurt, expectance, and her voice rode the chain like it was the only instrument she trusted. "Ryan, open this door right now. What gives you the right?" she screamed, every word a stone thrown at glass. Her fingers hooked the chain and pulled back, the sound of metal against metal, sharp and purposeful. I answered through the chain and the glass with the steady rhythm I'd practiced since the drive: calm, careful, firm. "You must call before you come, Mom, you have to ask." The words felt small in the space between us and huge at the same time, like a contract being read out loud. I could see the muscles in her jaw move, see the way entitlement bent her shoulders into accusation, but I didn't let the chain rattle again. I put the tiny speakerphone on the counter so she could hear me clearly, and I said it again, almost ritualistic: "If you want to visit, you call first, you don't just go in." She leaned closer to the glass and spat back something about family and how she had always been able to come in, how the house had been hers before it had been mine, how I was selfish. The words were old and reused, a script that had always let someone else take up space. I spoke through the chain and the glass, and my voice was the sound of a lock turning slowly. "I earned this, Mom. You would not have asked if the roles were reversed." Saying it felt like taking a breath after being underwater too long. Saying it was necessary even if it would break something along the way. There was a long, strange silence after that, like an empty room waiting for applause that would never come. Scout wound circles at my ankles and then sat staring at the door with the solemnity of a small witness. The porch light made Laura's face look softer and crueler at once, haloed in its usual charity while she stood outside that new line I had drawn. She stormed to the car at last, each step heavy, the engine starting with a metal cough that sounded like finality. The taillights left red tears across the street as she drove away, and the sound shrank until it disappeared. After the door closed and the house took a long, leveling breath, an ache settled in my chest that surprised me, not the hot flare of victory, not the sweet burn of having a boundary upheld, but loneliness, thin and gritty. I'd protected my home, yes, but in doing so I'd pushed away the person who had a right to be disappointed, who had previously been allowed to assume. Standing there in the small, locked kitchen with Scout rubbing my shins and the ring of new keys heavy in my palm, I realized building a line often means standing alone on one side of it. And sometimes that solitude is the price you pay for being taken seriously. My phone filled up like a rain barrel in a storm, missed calls stacking on top of each other until the screen looked like a confession. Laura called first and left a breathy voicemail that was half demand and half apology. Then Noah, then Dad, then a string of texts from Jessica that pinged with the little uptick of panic. I watched the little red badges multiply like charges on a ledger and felt that old smallness settle back in. The one that taught me to answer for everyone and fix what broke because I was used to being the fixer. When I called Laura back, she started loud and private all at once, the voice of someone who had always measured love in action and assumed the metric was universal. Ryan, we were just checking on the house. Your brother and Jessica need somewhere to land. You're being dramatic. I listened while she gave me the version she liked best, that she'd been saving me the trouble, that she'd left a note, that everything would be handled. I could hear the faith in her voice that family always knew best, and the anger, too, that I was making this personal when it could have been practical. I told her calmly, through a voice that clenched without breaking, that she had to ask first. You don't get to assume, I said. Silence popped like a misfired fuse, and she started again with the old lines about generosity and how this was for the kids. I let her speak, and I let the line go dead when it needed to. Noah came the next day like a man who had been hollowed out by numbers. He found me during my lunch break at the dental lab, breathless and a little ashamed, and for a long minute he tried the softened voice he used with clients, the one that reassured people before delivering bad news. Then something in him broke. He talked about Dad's construction company's slow contracts, unpaid invoices piling up, a lien they were trying to negotiate, and how suddenly their payroll had become a cliff. He said the word desperate like a verdict, and then looked at me as though I would understand and fix it because I always did. He admitted that Jessica had asked Mom to check the house to see if it might be a place to crash, or maybe to rent, or maybe to move into if things got worse. His eyes were wet and blunt, and he kept apologizing like apologies could reverse 9 minutes of trespass. Jessica called me after Noah left, voice small and raw in a way that made her confession feel like an offering. She said she'd asked Mom to come look because they were scrambling for options and she didn't know what else to do. She explained bills and threats and how they had both sat in the quiet at night trying to find a single plan that didn't make them disappear. It was the kind of honesty that opens you up to sympathy, the detail of their panic, the math that makes a home look like a variable you can move, but it didn't erase the image of them rummaging through my kitchen or the note in my mother's handwriting telling me they'd talk tonight. Motive softened the shape of what happened, but it didn't wash it clean. I sat with all of it, the calls like a chorus, Noah's breakdown like a drumbeat, and tasted the two truths at once. Compassion for people I loved who were suddenly fragile, and a deep, steady betrayal that felt like someone had rewritten my privacy with someone else's pen. I'd worked for 6 years to make a place where I could breathe without having to justify every inch, and that secret felt violated in a way that watching a bank account go negative never had. Sympathy didn't cancel the trespass. It didn't give them the right to treat my home like a flexible asset on which their peace of mind could be traded. So I held firm, which felt like refusing to be both a mattress and an ATM for my family. I told them plainly on the phone, then in person when it had to be said loud, that I would not be guilted into quick fixes. I would not let the house become an open ledger where they could write IOUs against my floorboards. If they wanted help, we could sit and make a plan, numbers, timelines, conditions, or a rental agreement that honored my boundaries and theirs equally. I made it clear that compassion didn't mean erasing rules, and caring didn't entitle anyone to trespass. That is a sentence no one likes to hear from family. You must ask. It sounded small and firm, a rule that was also a plea. I wasn't cutting them off, I was inviting negotiation with terms and respect attached. I offered to look into temporary solutions and to help them draw up something fair, but I refused to let my private life be pressed into service as the family's default safety net. It stung to be the one to insist on structure, to name the friction between love and entitlement. But naming it felt like the first step toward a way we could still be family together without erasing the work that got me here. I put the phone down and set a time like it was a marker in the sand. Sunday, 6:30. I told them all, Laura, Noah, Jessica, Olivia, and Dad, that I was cooking dinner and wanted everyone in one place at 412 Cedar Grove Lane so we could talk without the camera doing it for us. I wanted control of the room and the conversation because I was tired of being surprised into feeling small. I planned the menu the way someone plans the map home. Lasagna slow-cooked until the cheese bubbled and browned, garlic bread toasted until the edges were coal crisp, and a salad pulled from my little garden with lettuce still cool from the morning. I lit the string lights on the wraparound porch and polished the mantel until my reflection looked like a man who meant what he said. Scout threaded between my ankles like an expectant guest, and the porch swing creaked exactly like I had welded it to creak, a human sound in a human house that I had built for human need. When they arrived, the house felt full and small all at once in the best way. The original maple floors smelled faintly of oil and something like newness, and the kitchen looked like the magazine I'd used for inspiration, but real: a dented skillet, a chipped mug, a jar of oregano with a fingerprint on the lid. I put plates on the table, sat them down, and told them I wanted to walk them through the house first, room by room, because I needed them to see and not assume. In the entryway, I talked about the porch swing I welded myself and why I put it there, to make a place that could hold me at the end of a day without anyone else's permission. I opened the living room and told them about sanding the maple floors until my hands were callous and ache, about the late nights under a single lamp every time I wanted a quiet victory without applause. I wanted them to see the work and to understand that secrecy wasn't sneaking. It was a boundary I needed because I'd spent years being the one who stepped back. I took them into the kitchen and explained the choices: the butcher block island I sealed twice, the marble counter I saved for, the pendant lights I hung because light matters when you make a life you can stand in. I said plainly that I bought the house alone because I needed to prove to myself that I could be more than what everyone expected. I said it without flourish because I didn't want their pity. I wanted their comprehension and their respect instead. At the table, I laid out the rules like a simple recipe. Call before you come, don't show the house unless I invite you to, and don't assume my space is an ATM or a default fix for every problem. I spoke each line slow and steady so there would be no mistaking them for suggestions. If you want to visit, I told them, you call first. Respect is a two-way street, and this house is the punctuation mark between us. Saying it felt like putting a brand on the world where no one could erase it. Reactions came in human waves. Laura's hands trembled, and then she cried, small and sudden, not theatrical but real, old guilt and surprise mixing into salt and wet. Noah looked surprised the way someone looks when a friend you counted on becomes a stranger with steady eyes. He kept his jaw tight, and then later admitted what he had been unable to say the week before about how bad things had gotten at Dad's company. Olivia, the youngest, sat forward and defended me quietly, the kind of pride that doesn't shout but holds its head high. Dad listened, slow and heavy like a man who keeps a ledger for everything, and Jessica looked like she wanted to apologize before the words found her mouth. There was a round of honest talk that nobody had wanted to have in messenger apps or in half-sent voicemails. People named how they'd been frightened and what they'd hoped for, and I named what it felt like to be barged into. That violation isn't canceled by motive. We argued in soft voices and then we ate. The lasagna was a small peace offering, and the garlic bread made the room laugh once when someone knocked a plate and we all reached for it. When it was time to leave, the acknowledgement was fragile and quiet. Laura said I'm sorry with the kind of weight that shifts a room, and Noah said he understood the boundaries even if it hurt. Olivia hugged me like she'd always been on my side. It wasn't forgiveness in a neat bow, it was the beginning of something that might hold. Standing on the porch under the lights, Scout tucked against my calf, I felt both less alone and more responsible than ever. I hadn't won a battle so much as drawn a line that let me belong to my own life on my own terms. And that, in the end, felt like a strange, brave kind of homecoming. The day after the dinner, the house felt quieter in a way that wasn't empty so much as settled, like a room finally letting its shoulders down. I woke up and made coffee in the marble-lit kitchen, the smell folding into the morning and sitting on the maple like a benediction. Scout was already on the new couch, curled into a comma of orange fur where sunlight pooled, his tail twitching slow as he dreamed. I fed him, swept a line of crumbs off the island, and for the first time in months, I let myself move through the rooms without checking who might step through the door next. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a name I'd been waiting to hear differently: Laura. Her voice was softer, edged with something like embarrassment and pride at the same time. She started carefully, like she was testing the water, and then said she'd thought about what I said, the asking, the calling, the respect, and that she was proud of the man I'd become in her stubborn, blunt way. She didn't say everything I wanted, but the way she spoke was new. There was a thinness of apology and a weight of respect that hadn't been there before. I told her thank you, and the word felt enough for the moment. Noah sent a text later that afternoon while I was cleaning up the garden bed where I'd planted bulbs. His message was short and shaky, the kind of text that tries to be more formal than the fear behind it. Thanks for Sunday, we'll ask first from now on, I'm sorry man. I read it twice, thumb hovering over a dozen possible replies, and finally typed back something plain. I know I appreciate it, we'll figure this together. He answered with a promise to ask directly if they ever needed help, with a line about not wanting to take what wasn't freely given. That small paper promise mattered more than any grand gesture. Evenings slid into routines I had let go of while I built the place in secret. I turned on the string lights at dusk and watched the bulbs hum like a soft choir along the porch edge. The porch swing creaked in the way I'd welded it to creak, rhythm slow and sure under my weight, and I sat there sometimes with a beer and sometimes with nothing at all, letting the world pass by at the speed of neighborly life. I trimmed a few roses in the flower bed and planted a couple more bulbs, each small act feeling like a quiet expansion of what belonged to me and how I lived inside it. People still called sometimes to check in the way families do, which is to say often and with dear urgency about the weather and the dog and money. At first I bristled at every ring, then I learned to breathe, to answer with the same steady voice I'd used at the door when I changed the locks. Call before you come, I'd say now with a little laugh sometimes, and they would say they understood. It wasn't perfection, old habits are stubborn, but the promises held more than they had before. There was relief in being taken seriously, even if it came with the cost of some hard conversations. The house itself kept proving that I hadn't built it just to have keys and a mortgage. I had built it to keep a sense of myself. Scout found new favorite spots to sun, the hardwood took on the patina of daily life, and the kitchen showed signs of meals that mattered in the quiet way of leftovers and coffee rings. I hosted friends in small bursts, people who didn't assume or rearrange, and I watched them drift over the floors I'd sanded and seemed to understand without my saying much. That small recognition stitched something in me that felt like belonging practiced in small, steady stitches. A week later, I listened to a voicemail I had saved and replayed it 3 times before I let it sit in the unlocked corner of my screen. It was Laura, voice raw and real, and she said something I hadn't allowed myself to want in any big way. She said into the little recorded box, "You did good, son." The pause after the words was full of everything: guilt, pride, and a mother's admission that her son had become a man who could keep his ground. I saved the message like a talisman and felt something loosen inside me, like a knot finally unthreading. I still woke some mornings with a small ache, a leftover from all the years I'd been the invisible middle child handing out space like charity. But the ache was different now. It was the weight of a line I'd drawn and kept. The house at 412 Cedar Grove Lane made room for me to be both part of the family and separate from their assumptions. The victory was private and imperfect, held in a voicemail and in Scout's slow purr in the creak of the swing at sunset. In the end, I let myself believe those words, let myself keep the promise I had made to myself, and that quiet, stubborn truth felt like finally being at home.